and gentlemen, welcome to the Human Energy Field. We hope you've enjoyed the previous episodes. Hope you enjoyed last episode chatting with our friends Paolo and Connor of Middle Earth Crisis. That was great. We're going to be doing another one of those episodes in the near future. Keep your eyes peeled and your ears tuned for that one. Coming up on this episode, we are going to be discussing some books as usual. We also have Instagram questions to answer. We put out a poll on our Instagram, got some feedback, and we've chosen a few things to discuss. So we'll be bringing that to you live, tips for new GMs, etc., etc. And as usual, we'll be rounding out the end of the episode with a bit of talk about our Warhammer narrative project, Forges of Nothos. But first, I think there's been a competition going on Instagram, and I think it's about time we round that up to a conclusion. What do you think, Jamie?
I absolutely agree. It just so happens that as we're recording, it falls on the same day that we were going to draw the winners. So we're just going to draw them live, aren't we?
Right here, right now.
For those of you not aware of what we're doing, we have 5 copies of the excellent Eye of Terror fanzine, which is kind of old Hammer Warhammer fanzine issue 1, and we're going to post that free to 5 lucky listeners. All you had to do was be into the Discord, and we're going to select them from the Discord members at random now. I think also this is something in some form we're going to continue to do. So if you're listening to this and you think, oh, giveaway, great, then all you have to do to be in the next one is jump into our Discord, which the link to which is in the bio of the Instagram. So it couldn't be easier. It cost you nothing.
Through the Eye of Terror fanzine issue 1 is going to 5 lucky people. Jamie, let's read out the 5 lucky winners who are getting their copy posted to them free of charge.
Hans Reiter, JCR333.
I've actually played a game with him. Very, very nice chap.
Cool. Cosmic Wimp received the 3rd copy.
He's in one of my games as well. He's a very nice chap too.
Nice. Kill Chain will receive the 4th copy.
We know who that is, don't we?
And Mr. KM81.
Guys, well done.
I'll do a post for that, and I'll hit those guys up on the Discord, and I'll get their addresses, and those will be winging their way out to those people on first thing on Monday morning's post.
Cool, thank you for that. Okay, now on to the content of the episode. We are going to get right into it because we've got a very special book to talk about. The Judas Halo by Dungeon Punks. This is a book that's been a long time coming, written by friend of the show Nathan Bean of the Dungeon Punks. This has only come out recently. I think he's been posting it out to pre-orders for a while, and I believe there's still some in stock that he's selling. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I think the pre-orders received their copies probably like last week, this week. So yeah, I haven't had mine for very long. I've had mine for less than a week.
Yeah, this is the 3rd installment in the Dungeon Punks' Dungeon Punks'. This is the 3rd installment in the sort of expanded universe of the Dungeon Punks, which I think is a quite cool way to release adventure modules, is to have them all, at least in some way, be aware of each other or linked to each other. This specific book is an adventure. It's not a world book. I wouldn't describe it as a core book. I wouldn't describe it as a source book. It is an adventure module, in my opinion. And it comes with a t-shirt if you want, which is nice as well. So it's a nice little Dungeon Punks joint. What did you make of it? First impressions?
Loved it. I was looking forward to getting it. When I flicked through it, it's one of those things where, you know, when you pick up a new book or a new RPG, you just go, I have to run this. And I think that about a lot of things. But this is like, I literally went onto Instagram straight away and I was like, I need 4 or 5 players for this. And I've got 4 or 5 players for this. I'm running it in a couple of weeks. I'm already doing kind of like character discussions with my players. It's just one of those things where I read it and I went, this is this is different. I have to run this. This is going to be fun. So yeah, it's different is what it is.
Why is it different?
I think it takes an approach which, fair enough, isn't novel anymore, because we live in a beneath the inverted church kind of post-Zasakala landscape where that kind of death metal or hardcore inspired fantasy isn't necessarily new anymore, but it takes its enough inspiration from things like Lamentations and Morkborg and stuff like that, but it's got its own DNA thumbprint about it. So, and I think that's one of the things that is really great about the writer is his ability to conjure an image with his words, and to also create really interesting NPCs and locations. The whole thing oozes a certain style which really appeals to me. It's got that kind of almost like British kind of post-punk, kind of dark 2000 AD feel about it, which I kind of love. So it oozes its own style.
Yeah, I get that completely. Baked into the book itself, in the descriptions, in the writing, are rules for running this with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. So it's very kind of from the ground up a 5e adventure. Now I'm going to ask you what system you're going to use to run this game, but before I do, I did want to say, reading this made me think it would make a really good Troika game. Like you say, it's got that kind of British, quirky, kind of, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, it's a little bit kind of self-referential, a little bit kind of like self-aware, and it just kind of screamed Troika to me. So it seems like a perfect fit for some kind of OSR or post-OSR kind of system. Do you know what I mean?
I can totally see where you're coming from. I think it's almost testament to Troika how adaptable that system probably is, because it's so simple that you could kind of plug it into anything. I guess my only hesitancy for running it with Troika would be the conceptions of any players coming to a Troika table might expect something a little bit more lighthearted than this is, because this doesn't pull any punches, this adventure. I mean, it's got some pretty dark concepts.
True, and maybe darker than Troika is known to be.
I think it's just darker than most people assume Troika is. Whereas if you said the words Morkborg, then people would be like all ready for like, death and gore and horror. But I think, Troika it kind of doesn't take itself super seriously. You could certainly run it with the Troika system, and I think it would be fine. But I also think to any GM worth his salt, then you could adapt this to pretty much the system of your choosing, if I'm honest.
So going off the back of that, what system have you chosen to adapt to run Judas Halo?
I'm going to be running it with AD&D 2nd, purely on the fact that it's a bit simple. I'm running it as a one-shot. I think D&D 5th, there's a lot going on with that, and I think to create characters and run through an adventure with a one-shot, there's almost a little bit too much work there. So I'm going to use pretty much a AD&D 2nd revised with bits of Ravenloft. I think I'm going to use the simple horror and terror rules from the Ravenloft Domains of Dread hardback, because I just think the adventure suits that kind of fast decline into insanity almost.
So let's just go through this a little bit, seeing as that's what we do here on the podcast. So it's an adventure from start to finish. It also has a list of monsters and antagonists. It also has magic items, but all of these things are things that you'll encounter in the adventure. So it's not describing a larger world. It's saying here's the adventure, and then within this adventure that I'm describing, when you encounter X item or X monster, here's the stat block for that. So it's a kind of self-contained point A to point B.
Is it worth kind of briefly describing the plot without spoilers, do you think?
Yes, please.
Okay, so not to give too much away, but it's basically a group of adventurers end up taking on a job that kind of goes south very quickly. And because of that setup, and I love the way of the writing, it goes, the writer says, I don't care how this goes wrong, just trust me, this bit will go wrong for your players. And I kind of like that, because the writing has this little behind the curtain style about it, that where he mentions things that have happened in his game when he's been playtesting it, which I quite like, because then you're being led along this adventure by somebody who knows it, and it's got that very colloquial style, which I really like it. But so the adventurers get involved in a mission which kind of goes wrong, and then from there they are caught up in the events that leads them to a dark revelation, and therein kind of ends the tale. I know that's quite simple, but I think part of its appeal to me is the plot is quite simple.
Yeah, well, you don't want to overcomplicate things, especially for a one-shot,
Yeah.
because you need a simple framework for you and the players to lay over all your input on top of. So simple plots are the best.
There's enough little world nuggets in there, like little hints, that I could build up a larger kind of milieu around it and kind of develop the towns and the settings. So if you're inspired by it to kind of do a little bit of world building around it, there's definitely some jumping off points there. But for a one shot, I think the writer suggests 6 to 8 hours of playing time. I think that's quite long, but maybe that's because if he's using D&D 5th, then there are a couple of set piece. Well, there are. I mean, quite literally, there are a couple of set piece combats, and D&D 5th combats can take 45 minutes an hour for big combats with a group of player characters and multiple NPCs or a tough monster. So you do. I mean, 2 or 3 combats, you've got 2 hours there anyway. 2 or 3 hours straight away just in the combat. I know.
And dealing with combat is something we're going to come on to a little bit later, so stay tuned for that. I think, 5e combat can sometimes take a whole session of game just to get through one combat sometimes. But that's not to speak low of this adventure in particular, but more of just the system that I imagine the one that Nate's been using to playtest this and to run this with has been 5e throughout, and that's why the rules are in 5e. It's written with 5e rules, etc.
Well, I believe, I'm not Nate's biographer, but I believe when they jumped back into playing RPGs, D&D 5th had just come out. So when they decided to play D&D, they went and bought the beginner box, and that was it. They'd set them on this line. And I also see the sense in doing it for D&D 5th. It is, of course, by far the edition most people are today familiar with. It appeals to a lot of new players, and let's be honest, D&D is D&D is D&D. If it doesn't take a lot to transfer these monsters or NPCs from one version of D&D to another.
True. So in one respect, it's quite a versatile adventure.
It's firmly D&D, but even then, yeah, I mean, you can. I can't imagine any real difficulty a Pathfinder GM struggling with this, or a DCC GM struggling with it. In a way, I think it could make an interesting low-level DCC adventure because it's got that kind of dark. I want to say almost like Guy Ritchie film feel about it. Is that? I don't know if I'm too off center there, and I don't know if Nate would hate me for saying that, but it's kind of got this kind of slick shit goes wrong, kind of British Tarantino feel about it. I don't fantasy, there's a lot of things going on in there. It's a great mixing pot.
Yeah. I could imagine this adventure being directed by Shane Black, for example.
Okay, yeah, there you go. So that's a better choice.
It's got the kind of descent into a criminal underworld kind of thing. Yeah, I see that, definitely, man, definitely. I mean, I just picture all the NPCs being voiced with Nate's accent, and it just makes it feel like a Guy Ritchie film. So maybe that's what it is. I really like that there's... the random tables stand out to me when I flick through it, because that's where my eyes always go when I've got my GM's hat on, and he's put in generator tables here for player character plot twists. So like secret motivations and that kind of thing. And he's also got NPC motivation table as well, which is really cool, as well as some magic items. So, I mean... When I read books and when I look at books, I'm a utilitarian. I like to go, okay, well, what can I take from this and use somewhere else? How much use is this book going to give me as a toolbox? So the random tables and the lists of items and stuff make this for me. If it was just an adventure, start to finish, with no extras, I'd be a bit less inclined to be looking at it. But because he kind of... fluffed it out and packed more into it. He's got maps for combat. He goes and talks about all the different monsters, and they've got paragraphs of description, and stat blocks are there, and they've got special abilities that he's made up. That kind of rounds it out for me. It makes it more than just an adventure. It makes it an actual book that belongs on a shelf.
Yeah, I can see that. I think those random tables, as you've said previously, the items and NPCs are all intimately tied up with this kind of ABC adventure, but there are certainly, as there are with a lot of these kind of products, the NPCs can be great inspiration for NPCs you might put in your own game, even if you're not running this adventure. Some of the background elements, no spoilers again, but the big baddies and stuff like that. You could definitely put that into your games as inspiration. But I think as RPG players in general, quite often we are used to beg, stealing and borrowing ideas from various places and throwing them into our games, aren't we? I mean, you can't run every adventure module you buy, and if you do, all credit to you, you either don't have a lot of modules or you have way more time than I have. But quite often you can enjoy the adventure module and go, well, I'm not going to run that, but I love this idea, or I love this character, or I love this NPC, or I love this set piece, and I'm going to borrow that. And there are definitely things in here that if I wasn't running it, I would definitely borrow them, especially the location at the beginning, the kind of setup. There's no spoiler here, but the setup for the adventure takes place in this, almost like this lighthouse on a rocky crag. And the way it's described and the way it's set up, it's just wonderful. And it's kind of Lovecraftian, kind of dark fantasy. And it's a really unique setting, jumping off point for the adventure. And it's definitely a location that I would use again. So there's definitely stuff in here that you could use other places. I agree with that, yeah. But I think at its whole, it's less of a toolbox and more of a simple adventure, if I'm being honest. And that's not necessarily a negative point, but I think that's where the book sits for me.
No, yeah, definitely. I mean, the same with their previous releases. They write adventures. The Dungeon Punks guys write adventures, so the added elements make it more palatable for me. And on the flip side of that, there is one section in the book. It's only a little paragraph. He mentions the players are travelling between one location and another location, and then he says, grab something suitable for your campaign from the monster manual or invent something. And I read that and I thought to myself, but I'm reading this book. I've got this book in my hands. You know, he's clearly capable of coming up with cool monsters. And then I got to that paragraph and it said, go to look in the monster manual or put something in your game. And I just thought, but I'm reading the Judas Halo. You know, why don't you want to give me something?
Yeah.
So again, you know, it's exactly like you were just saying. We're used to borrowing, and stealing from other books, and I guess that's part of the mindset, isn't it? Is it all right? You've got other things on your shelf. Go and use some of them.
Yeah, I get that, and you know, he could have maybe thrown in a wandering monster chart with the monsters from the monster manual that he thinks most suit this tone, even if he'd just done that and gone like, you know, here is a selection of monsters which I would suggest. But I guess, you know, it would have been maybe just as easy to go, here are some weird wolf type creatures or whatever. If you feel you need another combat, throw these against the players. If you don't worry about it. But you're right, I think referencing the monster manual, I get it, it's easy. If you're running D&D, you've probably got those 3 books, but you could have just chucked something in there. But you know, it's a minor gripe, isn't it?
Minor gripe. Although that does make me think of something interesting. I know that Wizards are quite hot with their copyright laws. Would you be able to mention specific Dungeons and Dragons monsters by name in a book that isn't licensed by them at this point? Because I know they're pretty good with copyright, aren't they? You know, they make you refer to them as world's greatest RPG or whatever it is that they like to be called when you're not saying Dungeons and Dragons specifically.
I think, okay, so there's 2 things here. I'm not ultimately aware of whether it's something that's sold for money or sold for profit. So I don't know if it's a non-for-profit book, whether that covers that. And the second thing is, there's no OGL, like kind of open gaming license disclosure in the book. So you've got to be careful not to use anything that isn't covered. Do you know what I mean? So maybe you're not using... I think it's probably okay to say, go and get your monster manual or whatever. Yeah, I don't know whether repeating any kind of protected material from other books, I'm not really sure. I don't know how much it matters, if I'm honest, for something so small. As far as I'm aware, if you want to produce stuff for D&D, you have to kind of include a copy of the kind of open gaming license in your publication. So I don't know if that's a technical oversight or whether it's just something that he didn't deem was necessary or indeed is not necessary. I'm not massively sure about the current status of writing stuff for D&D, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I mean, less about this specific book, but more in general. I'm just kind of curious about how does one go about navigating those kind of legal areas.
As far as I'm aware, it's the declaration. If you're producing something that's connected to D&D, there is a page that you put in, which is the kind of declaration of the open gaming license that kind of says, that acknowledges you are using D&D's the content that D&D allows people to use, so like the basic system and stuff like that. I mean, that was the case back with the old 3.5, whatever. I'm going to put my hands up and say that I haven't looked at the current state of the open gaming license and other open gaming licenses that exist at the moment. So anybody listening who knows better, please do email us at humanenergyfieldpodcast@gmail.com, or get on the Discord or hit us up on Instagram and feel free to educate us on the current status of the open gaming license, particularly as it appertains to Dungeons and Dragons, if it so pleases you to do that. But yeah, I think that there is definitely something that needs to be done if you're publishing something that is a D&D kind of spin-off that uses the current rules. I think there is some boxes you have to tick and some lip service you have to pay to Wizards.
That has temporarily satisfied my curiosity. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
But on the whole, I think it does a good job of elevating what the Dungeon Punks guys have done so far with their adventure modules and rounding out their current menu of offerings. Going from the first one up to this has been quite a ride.
Yeah, I think also, if anything, for people who either do listen to the Dungeon Punks podcast, and if you're not, what are you doing? But for people who do, and you ever wondered what being a fly on the wall at a Dungeon Punks D&D game looks like, then this adventure is definitely that window into the zany, snack-filled, curry-aromaed D&D table that Dungeon Punks will be playing. So for that, if nothing else, then it's a great kind of insight.
That's the best ending to the review we could hope for. I don't want to say anything else from there, so we're going to move on straight from that. Fantastic, man. Thank you for that. Yeah, check out Judas Halo. Check out In the Name of Suffering. Check out Depths of Drasted. Just check them out. Go and have a look at the podcast. Go and listen to their SoundCloud, the Spotify. Check them out on Instagram. They're good guys.
Yeah, and I think also with the other ones you've just mentioned, I think they're bringing out new versions of the old adventures, like kind of extended versions or kind of like remixes, if you will. So for people who want to get involved and pick up multiple adventures by these guys, then keep your eyes peeled, because I believe they're incoming.
Cool. Okay, yeah, keep your eyes peeled for those. I'm sure we'll at least mention it or announce it when they're releasing those updated editions. That'll be really exciting. Have you seen the June book has come out? Modiphius's June RPG.
Do you know what? I haven't. It is one of those things that I'm not massively excited for. We can get into the whys and wherefores of that, but just to put my hands on the table, I'm not massively excited by it. So it's one of these things I'm going to pick up kind of on the cheap when I see the opportunity. I'm not in a rush to get it, but if I see a copy that's for what I think is an okay price, then I will definitely be picking it up to look through it.
Yeah, man, same. I'm not massively hyped for it, but I am very interested, and I do really want to give it a look-see. The more I read about it, the more curious I get about this book. I know it's based on the Frank Herbert books and not the film, which immediately makes me more interested.
I honestly don't know if there's much difference between the books and the film. Does the film take the story or characters in a different direction?
We'll have to wait when it comes out and see. I don't know. But as in, no matter what the film does, I mean, I'm referring to the new film that's due out. No matter what the film does, it's not going to cover the events from the first book to the sixth book. Do you know what I mean? It's only going to be one. It's only going to be the one film. Whereas, from what I've heard, June Adventures in the Imperium by Modiphius is inspired and takes from the Herbert books as a saga. So there might be some stuff in there that the films don't mention, because maybe you're talking about some stuff from Chapter House or some stuff from God Emperor or whatever it might be.
Do you know whether the RPG takes the prequel novels as canon?
No, I don't know that. Probably not.
Right. That's interesting, isn't it? So
yeah, it is interesting. I believe it starts from the events of the first book and moves forward from there.
Right. Okay. But I mean, I'm not a massive fan of that system that they use. I wasn't bowled over by Star Trek. I was not impressed by Conan. So for me, and also I'm not massively excited to get onto this Dune hype train that is kind of slowed down a lot recently, but I'm sure will the engines will roar back up as the closer we get to seeing it. I think it's Dune is going to be everywhere at some point. And I think I'm already bored of it, if you know what I mean. And that's coming from somebody who loves the original novels. I have a real deep love for them. But I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Anyone who really wanted to play a role-playing game in the Dune universe could have and should have been doing this for decades already.
Very, very true. Very good point. Why were you waiting until now if you were a Dune fan? Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the reasons Traveller, the role-playing game, was created, in order to act as a vehicle for you to play out your favourite sci-fi, novels, whether it be Asimov or Herbert or George Lucas or whatever it happens to be. And you could have easily ran it with GURPS if that's your cup of tea, or whatever you could have done it. And we all know that there's no better source material than the original novels. But I think what this is going to be is this game will be a vehicle for people who are fans of the movie. And I think even though saying it's based off the books and not the movie, it's coming out at the same time. It's part of the same hype train. So it's going to be appealing to the fans of the movie who have gone on Wikipedia and read about the novels, but aren't actually going to go and read the novels. But I mean that is a thing, that is it's what people do, isn't it? And then
we know
kind of argue the finer points of the Dune extended universe and having never read it. But so I don't know. I just think it's going to be, it's like a cash in for me, and I hate to say that, and I'm going to reserve my true judgment until I've looked through it, as we should do. But for me, I don't get what I'm going to get from this book that I'm not going to get from just going back to the novels and rereading them, if that's what I choose to do.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll hold you to that. Well, let's come back to that once the book is out and we've both had a read on it.
And I think people are also really excited about Dune as an RPG license because it really hasn't been available before. There really hasn't been a widely available Dune RPG. There was a game produced by Last Unicorn Games that was only released at a Gen Con, so limited numbers were released. And you'd see it floating around, for crazy money some people want for it. I bought and sold it before, and, it's not much to write home about. It's quite a thin hardback. It's okay. It uses a lot of the artwork that was used by, I forgot what company it is, but there was a Dune collectible card game around the same time. So it uses a lot of that artwork, which isn't terrible. But the game didn't cover everything that it should have done. It makes references to some source books that never were released, and it feels like a kind of very thin core starter book. And to me, it's not a great game, and it's only due to its rarity that it holds such a high price on the secondary market. I don't think it has that actual value to it as a game, and because of the high price of that book and its scarcity, I think most role players have never had the opportunity, or have never taken the opportunity, to role play in Frank Herbert's universe of Dune. So I think this is going to be a direct in for them. So I think that's why there's a lot of hype for the RPG, because it's a well-known it was a well-known cult license, obviously from the David Lynch film, long before this movie came along. So you've got those old school fans, and then you're going to have a whole new wave of fans coming along with the new movie, and they're all going to flock to this RPG. Really, I mean that's what it's for, in my opinion.
People need an in, and this is your in. I mean, whether it's a well put together game or not, we'll have to wait and see. But I'm logging my interest here on the recording. I'm stating that this is something that I'm quite interested in. So, I like the idea of creating your own noble house, and I like the idea of architect play when you're the puppet master, moving agents around the galaxy. I like some of the things that they're discussing in the synopsis for the book. Whether or not they pull it off, we'll have to wait and see.
It's not going to be difficult, is it, to go online and get involved in a Dune game once the movie comes out and this book's available. It's going to be a lot of opportunity, I think.
That's true. Maybe that's what I'll do then. Good point. So stay tuned for that one, guys. We'll see how that goes. Next up, I have a book that I want to tell you about. I want to tell the listeners about. It's a book that is very close to my heart. It's a book that I don't see getting anywhere near the amount of love that it deserves, or recognition, or even understanding. It's a book that I feel, if you like good writing, you should have on your shelf, no matter what sort of genres you're interested in. And it's a book that's influenced both my writing and my role-playing. The book is called The Wake, and it's by an author called Paul Kingsnorth. And I've chosen to discuss it because even though it's been out for nearly 7 years now. I want to recommend it to people to read.
Well, it's not a book that I've heard of or come across, so I will be in that audience of people learning about the Wake as we go through it.
It's set 1,000 years ago, in 1066. It's a post-apocalyptic novel where it follows an Anglo-Saxon landowner who is kind of dealing with the Norman Conquest and dealing with the effects of that conquest on his land. He loses his family, he loses his siblings, and he ends up in the kind of wilds in the Lincolnshire Fens, waging a guerrilla war against the Norman invaders. Specifically, and what is most special about this book, is that it's written in a invented language. The author has put together Old English, which is what would have been spoken in Anglo-Saxon times before the Normans invaded. The author's put together Old English and combined it with the English that we speak into what he calls a shadow tongue, which is about as much Old English as he can get away with for our modern eyes to be able to understand as any kind of language.
To still make it readable and kind of accessible.
Yes, you still make it accessible and readable, but nevertheless, definitely 100% plunges you into what Old English would have felt like, what Old English would have sounded like. You know, you're encouraged to read this book aloud, which I have done, and it's got a beautiful kind of cadence to it, and it's almost kind of hauntingly hypnotizing.
Do you know, in a weird way, what it reminds me of, and I don't mean this at all in a flippant sense, but it reminds me, I was at college reading Irvine Welsh books, and they're written in kind of Scottish language, like written in Scottish slang, and they make more sense if you actually read them out loud. They're quite hard to read, but once you get into that particular vernacular, it sets the scene and the tone. So I can understand what you're saying. You know, once you're in it. It might be a little bit stuff to fight through, but it creates that extra atmosphere.
Exactly. Once you're in it, exactly. And yeah, like Irvine Welsh writes phonetically, doesn't he? So you read it out loud and you find yourself pronouncing these Scottish words that if you don't have a Scottish accent, you wouldn't have any clue how to arrive at. And this, yeah, in a way, you're right, in a way, this does kind of do the same thing. I won't obviously subject listeners to my own reading of this book, but if you do want to hear it being read aloud, you can go onto YouTube and type in Mark Rylance, because he has done a reading of The Wake. He's actually got the film rights to this book. Mark Rylance is a big fan of this book and plans on playing the main character in a directed and written film adaptation coming out soon. So Keep your eyes peeled for that. The Wake, starring Mark Rylance, who's a amazing British actor.
I don't normally do audiobooks, but would you suggest that I listen to it instead of reading it, or do you think it really deserves a reading?
That's a good question, because I don't do audiobooks either. Nah. Read it aloud and read it yourself, because there's an element of fun in reading any book aloud, I think. But particularly with this one, when you're reading the words yourself, it puts you into the mind of the narrator. It's written in first person, so I went there, I did this. He's not a reliable narrator, and his state of mind changes as the book goes on, and he kind of descends, and you descend with him, because your only perception of this world is what he gives you. So you're kind of on this ride with the narrator. If I had an audiobook, I think I would spend the whole time thinking about how reading it would be better. So I would recommend that you just get a copy.
Got ya. So I know you said obviously it's a historical novel, but is it firmly historical? Does it have any supernatural elements, for example?
Well, that's an interesting question, because what was your perception of the supernatural 1,000 years ago? It's like he's got this idea of moving in locations and moving through these wild lands. This is a time before castles in England, for anyone listening. The Norman Conquest in 1066 was when William the Conqueror, otherwise known as William the Bastard, travelled over from France with a questionable claim to the English throne, and basically conquered what at the time was a amalgamation of Anglo-Saxon tribes and Anglo-Saxon landholds and that kind of thing, and then the Norman and through the Norman Viking influence kind of came into Great Britain from there. So you've got all these gods and myths anyway that the sort of regular folk would have in their lives. So the supernatural elements are kind of blurred. There's no outward monsters or spells or anything like that.
Sometimes these novels assume that the supernatural beliefs at the time are indeed real, and some just assign them to belief. And I just wondered where the Wake sits on that part of it, you know.
Yeah, it assigns it to belief. It's a real kind of character-driven story. It's a real. It looks at the people, and it looks at the effects on the people that who have had their homes taken away from them by these invading Normans. It tells a story of survival, you know, rather than slaying dragons or anything like that.
Yeah, but you what also piqued my interest there is you said it has influenced your role playing. Tell us more about that.
Because of the kind of nature of the characters in the book, you've got these guys. The main character, whose name is Buckmaster of Holland, Holland being a small district in Lincolnshire. He's a landowner here. I think he owns a couple acres of land, and he has men who work the land, etc. And then the impacts that the Norman Conquest has on him, and by extension his family and the village where he lives, and the kind of adventure that it sends him off on. It's got this real kind of weight to it. I know there's that very cliche, all my role-playing characters' backstories involve their parents dying and their villages being burned down and this kind of thing. And this kind of uses that in a real grounded way that makes you care about where else he's going to be going after that. It makes you really care about what is to come based on what has passed, if you like. He's got a real relationship with what he believes are spirits and gods, and he that kind of comes through in everything he does. He's got this real, like, deep grounded kind of belief in himself and in his version of England or Angland.
Right.
It's good drawing for motivation, inspiration. It's also really good because from a historical point of view, as I said, this was a time before castles existed in England. The Normans were the first ones to start building castles everywhere. It makes you look at castles not as kind of these historical landmarks, but as the result of violent occupation. So you read the book, suddenly your mind's changed from, oh no, these castles aren't a part of English history. They're invaders coming here and establishing their own thing. You know, obviously it's very convoluted, and that's another conversation for another time, but having that different outlook on the same landscapes translates really well into role-playing games, because it starts making you look at tropes like castles in a completely brand new light. You know, this isn't the castle of an English king and then we're all living around the castle and we're going to do jobs for the purser. This is an invader who has come in with his own ideas, built this horrible stone monstrosity on a hill that we used to worship, etc., etc. So there's a lot of twists of existing tropes. There's a lot of new light shone on things that we are aware of, and there's a lot of parts of history that it brings to the forefront that we have forgotten about. I think that's one of the reasons why I really like it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's probably a time period it's the kind of time period it's not traditionally covered by kind of fantasy RPGs, is it? It's kind of much older than that. Is this Dark Ages, or is this too late to be Dark Ages? I can never quite remember where the kind of official historians' dates are for Dark Ages.
Yeah. I mean, I'm maybe there's no official time period. You know, I'm not sure, but
Damn that.
This is during elements of the Dane Law as well, up in the north of England, Scotland. This is when the Vikings have got their imprint on the country,
right?
And that was in the kind of pre-1000 AD. You know, in the hundreds.
Right. Okay.
We had the kind of the main Viking invasions, and then coming into the year 1000 and then 1066 is when these early kind of Norman monarchs made their stamp on the country.
Right.
William the Conqueror himself being a descendant of Rollo the Viking.
I just put that into the internet there, and it seems to suggest the Dark Ages are estimated. I don't know why it's estimated to have stretched from the year 500 up to 1066. So this is the Dark Ages have been before this, but now we're coming out of the Dark Ages into what I assume is, kind of other history or whatever. But it's interesting that the Dark Ages is everything kind of maybe up to this.
This is a real turning point in the history of the United Kingdom for a lot of reasons, and that being just one of them. Language started to change. We went pretty much from Old English into Middle English. We had a lot of Norman words come into the language, and French became the language of nobility, etc., etc. So this is before all of that. This is a very different time. People spoke and acted very differently. The gods were very different.
Do you think that the setting of the novel would make a good background, say, for a game of D&D or a fantasy RPG?
I think it would be excellent. Yeah, really excellent.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. And reading the book without any spoilers, there's a lot of reasons why. I think, there's a lot of role-playing books, and there's a lot of settings, and there's a lot of adventures that have some kind of doom or apocalypse is nigh. Something big and horrible is happening, and the players are a very small part of that. I'm thinking about Shadow the Demon Lord, I'm thinking about Morgborg, whatever it might be. It's nice to have those big, long, overarching things in the background, and this is almost the originator of that. What is more post-apocalyptic than living in the countryside and then having your entire villages decimated by strange-looking foreigners who shave their beards and ride horses, which was like a bizarre concept at the time. So it has this real kind of cataclysmic feel throughout the book. The fact that everyone's lives have been upturned, and he's the narrator's in denial, and he can't recognize the strength of the enemy because of the damage they've done and the hurt that they've caused and all of this kind of thing. And then together with a small band of other people that he picks up from various little villages, he ends up becoming a leader of this little guerrilla band of fighters who are hiding in the fens and kind of setting off on kind of guerrilla attack runs on the Normans as they go down the road. And as the Normans are trying to establish a foothold in the east of England, they're kind of the resistance fighters, if you like. So it would make a really great RPG setting. Everyone wants to be the resistance fighters against the big evil empire, don't you? And this is basically the earliest possible version of that, I think.
All right, cool. That sounds great.
It's really great. It's really, really good. And even if it wasn't written in this kind of invented Old English shadow language, it would still be a really cracking read. But because it's written in this way, you read it out loud, and it's really kind of rhythmic, and it just makes you feel like you're in a swamp when you read it. It's hard to explain. You guys just honestly get your hands on this book and give it a read, because it's a real winner.
Has the author has he done a lot of other things, or is this kind of his first big hit, so to speak? Or
so this book came out in 2014. This was the author's debut novel, believe it or not.
Oh wow, okay.
And he couldn't get it published anywhere, so he ended up getting it crowdfunded on a platform called Unbound, which has also released some really great titles. So check out Unbound for good fiction crowdsourcing. But Paul Kingsnorth, he is a writer otherwise. He's done a lot of journalistic pieces. He's also done another book before this, which wasn't a fiction book, called Real England, which I've got here on my shelf as well, that investigates how globalization is destroying kind of historical culture in England and the UK. So if you're sad at the closure of pubs across the country, or you're sad at the treatment of canals, then that's the book for you. It kind of looks at how our own culture is being dissolved and demolished by the powers that be.
Wow, grim stuff.
Yeah, grim stuff. It's it's a factual book. It's not a fictional novel, but it's very interesting and it's pretty doomy. Um, it examines like what does it mean to be English at a time when our flag is associated with racist hooliganism.
Right.
He's trying to tackle these kind of topics. He's like, well, we don't have no history. English people do have a rich and varied history, but how problematic is it that whenever anyone, including ourselves, looks at our own flag, we think racism is so that yeah, do you know what I mean? So this is the sort of guy he is. He's trying to examine things in a new lens and look at why current and social trends are just one small little flash in the pan of the real kind of bigger historical picture.
Interesting stuff, man. I mean, that will definitely go onto my reading list, which is arguably already too long. But
I honestly, if anyone ever said to me, recommend me one book to read, it would be The Wake by Paul Kingsnorth. Really, just up there, one of my top all-time favorite books.
Nice, good, strong recommendation.
Very strong recommendation. He's also done a kind of spiritual sequel called Beast, which is the second in a proposed trilogy. The Wake is 1,000 years ago. Beast, the second book, is set in present day, and the third book in the trilogy he plans on doing in 1,000 years' time. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that trilogy kind of rounds itself out and comes together. That's going to be quite interesting.
That. It's really interesting, actually. Great concept.
Yeah, and Beast is great in its own way. It's nothing like The Wake. It's a different kind of good. But I do recommend getting Beast if you can. These books have got very good cover art. I've got Beast in hardback. It's a lovely little book. I don't
want to get too much into it, but tell me what Beast is. Give me a one-line synopsis of what that is.
One man's lonely descent into madness.
Okay, cool.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas The Wake is more of an actual story with these overarching historical elements. Beast is more of an inverted kind of introspective drama, I suppose.
Yeah, both sound good,
Yeah, really, honestly, really cracking read. I know we talked about how it could inspire RPGs, and I think just reading it and the atmosphere that it invokes and the sense of place that it gives off is enough for you to go, fuck man, I just want to run anything in the fens. Just get me to the bogland, get me to the marshes where I can just be with my ancestors where I belong, I want to be up to my neck in the tar and the marshes and the mud, and just I want to paint myself black with fire ashes and then sneak around in the dead of night and slit some throats of Frenchmen and stuff. It really just makes you want to kind of get into it and be a part of that world. It's rich. This book is rich. So yeah, really recommend that. And the author as well is a friend of George Monbiot, who we all know and love. So The Wake, check that out. If you enjoyed reading it, let us know. And if it inspired your own role playing, then let us know as well. I'd love to hear what you got up to.
Yeah, I think. Do you know what? After this as well, I'm going to get you to post that on the Discord and see if any of our Discord members have read it and have any thoughts on it. Because can quite often get a good discussion on some books in our Discord. So
yeah, that's very true. There's a lot of stuff that pops up in there that I don't expect to see or never heard of, and it ends up becoming real kind of fascinations. Just things that are maybe not in my direct wheelhouse, but something that someone goes, oh, you know what? I know that you're into this and this. Well, have you checked out this kind of thing? And then someone else will pop up and be like, oh, actually, this is really good. Yeah, there are these big roundtable discussions about books or music or whatever else, and it's always valuable. So if you have any hand in input on the Discord, can't thank you enough. And if you're not on the Discord already, why not get in there, join in? Speaking of interaction, we recently had a poll put up on the Instagram, didn't we? Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it surprised me that this is something I hadn't really done before. Instagram's really good for this on the stories, throwing up like a poll or ability to ask questions and make comments. So I thought, as we were preparing to record this episode, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to just throw out a question? And it only had 24 hours for it, but we got quite a few responses, which is great. I thought I'd throw out the question of what kind of games, what kind of things would you want us to do, what kind of things would you want us to hear us talk about on the show? And I just thought it might be interesting. Maybe a couple of people will say the same thing. Maybe some people will suggest things that I hadn't thought of. It's always valuable, as we've always said from the beginning of this. We want to make this a two-way street as much as possible and get feedback and suggestions and stuff from the community at large. And we actually had quite a few good, solid suggestions. So what I want to try, I can't cover them all in this episode, unfortunately. But what I'm going to do is maybe continue to do that every now and then, throw that question out there. But we've got enough to work through for a few episodes. And one of the comments that was made yesterday was advice on dealing with and making combat more interesting in RPGs. And one of the other comments was advice for new GMs. Now, I'd like to think occasionally we can give out, GMing advice that is useful to new GMs or experienced GMs, whether you've been GMing for, days or years or decades. I think there's always the opportunity to pick up new skills and learn new stuff. I know I always do, and I've been doing this longer than I care to tell anybody. So, but yeah, so I think in order to kind of kill two birds with one stone, if you will, to make a combat reference, we wanted to talk a little bit about combat in RPGs and try and give some tips and tricks, maybe for new GMs, but I'd like to think we talk about it in enough depth that experienced GMs can get something out of this as well.
Yeah, so thank you for sending in those answers, because hopefully this is something that we're going to be able to help you out with, and at the same time pass on the knowledge that we've got to other people. I know I like hearing and reading tips for GMs. I've been doing this for a while now, but I'm never stop learning, do you? It's always interesting to see how other people approach it, no matter what their level of skill or no matter how many years they've been doing it. Always interesting to hear from different GMs. So with that in mind, I think it's quite a pertinent line of discussion for us to take.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's always good to hear how different people do things, and even if you just hear one thing that makes you think, "Oh, do you know what? I'm going to try that. That's a good idea." Or you might think, "I already do that," or you might think, "These are already good points. I already do them. That's great." Whatever you get from the discussion is valuable. But I think certainly for new GMs, there can be a lot of little hints and shortcuts and little reminders that can often make games go a lot more smoothly. And a GM's work is hard, man. I mean, you got to remember there's a lot of work for a GM to do. Writing the story, controlling the players, the NPCs, the monsters, knowing the rules, all of these kind of things. There's a lot of weight sometimes on the shoulders of GMs, and I think new GMs can quite often be overwhelmed by the amount of responsibility that they have in that position. So anything that we can do to kind of throw a bone in their direction and help them out a little bit, I think is always good, in the least condescending way possible, because we all started our first session not having ran a session before. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm nodding my head along to everything that you said. I know no one can see me, but I'm absolutely agree with that. I think it's valuable to have this kind of view of everyone at some point ran a first session without ever having run one before. And you honestly never know what sort of style you'll develop until you go for it and see what comes out of it. So I think it's really key to just get stuck in. Answer the question for us, and then I'll give some tips of my own. But do you want to take this one first?
Basically, what we're going to do is cover ways to make combat easier and more dramatic and kind of serve your game better. And I think when I mused over this morning, I think it's good to take a dual approach to this. I think there's two ways to look at combat in RPGs. I think the first is mechanical, and the second is drama. So I want to cover the mechanical aspect of combat first, because I think some of the things I'm going to mention here will make combats in your RPGs just run much more smoothly. Some of it may seem very obvious, especially the GMs have been doing it a while, but don't overestimate the usefulness of the easy stuff. So the first thing that I really want to get over is know your rules. And I think it's quite easy for GMs to read through a book and think that they know the rules, especially for games that are relatively complicated. D&D 5th might be a mainstream game, but it has a lot of rules to remember, a lot of book flipping, there's a lot going on there. So for somebody who hasn't done a lot of role-playing, something like that can be quite intense and quite intimidating. So make sure that you're at least well familiar as a GM with the combat rules of the game. Because as players sit down to the table, don't forget that they're expecting you to be able to guide them through this game. Even if they claim they've read it and played it before, the GM is the guide for the rules. You know, the players should be looking to the GM for rulings and advice on the mechanical aspects of the game. So, and that also mentions, you know, if you're a player, please do your due diligence and try and read the rules if you can before you go to a session. But as the GM is the one with the ultimate responsibility for that, please make sure that you know your rules. And what I mean by this is not just have you read the rulebook and do you understand it. You don't have to learn every weapon in the weapons table. All you need to learn is the 4 or 5 weapons that your players are using. So if one of them has a particular kind of sword, why don't you just revise what damage and attack stats or whatever that sword has? And you only need to do that for 4 of your players, and then whatever your monsters are using, just memorize those 4, and then they're going, oh, what do I roll for damage? You're using a 2-handed battle axe. You're going to roll, I don't know, D10 plus your strength modifier. Do yourself a little cheat sheet. If you as the GM have your players' hit points, your players' weapons and strength bonuses, etc., and whatever else you think you need for combat in front of you, that's going to make combat run a lot more smoothly. You don't have to ask a lot of questions of your players. And normally you have a player group of, say, 3 to 5 people. Having 3 sets of those stats in front of you isn't a huge amount of paperwork. If I know that the dwarf has got this many hit points, this is his armor class, this is his weapon and how much damage he does, it cuts down a lot of those questions in combat that you just don't need to ask over and over again. Or what's your AC again? Or what's this? Or what? Roll for damage. And your player goes, what damage do I roll? And you just D10, you know? I've got it right in front of me. So don't worry about memorizing, you know, all of the armor classes and damage rolls for every weapon and piece of armor. You only have to know what your players are using. And then if they switch armor, great. Update that little cheat sheet that you have. And you can also choose your monsters and NPCs with the same amount of kind of restrictiveness if you want. If you want to use monsters that you know very well at first and then revise a monster that you're going to, or an NPC that you're going to put into your game, it's important that you know how that monster fights. You know the monster's special attacks and special defenses before you go in it, because nothing ruins a combat more than, oh, hang on, wait, I've just got to read what this does and I've just got to read how this works. So if you want to use, I don't know, some big creature, you know, like, make sure you know what it does. Make sure you know how it will work in combat, how its special attacks and defenses work, what its armor class is, how much damage it dishes out. Because once you know that, you'll start making, you'll be able to balance your encounters better, because all of a sudden, if you see that this monster does, I don't know, 3d6 damage, and all of your player characters have got like 4 hit points, then you already know that that's going to cause death very quickly. And that might be a good indicator of, oh, hang on, actually, maybe this isn't a good idea. Let's scale this down, or let's reduce its attack dice, or all of this kind of stuff in order to scale it better for the adventure. And quite often in published adventures, the encounters will be balanced, or it'll tell you what kind of party level the party should be. But when you're writing your own, it's very difficult to over or under balance those encounters. And knowing the monsters ahead of time, knowing what armor they have and what damage they do, is a great indicator of whether this fight is going to be difficult or easy for your player characters. So learn the monsters that you're using, learn what the player characters have that information ready so you don't have to ask them in combat all the time. Especially if you've only got, like you say, 3 or 4 players, then having their armor class and stuff in front of you is a great time saver. So do a little bit of work ahead of time. It's going to make every combat that you do a lot simpler. Because let's be honest, most player characters have an iconic weapon or a set of armor that they're going to wear time and time and time and time again. It's not common for your PCs to switch up their weapons very often and change their armor very often. So you're not going to have to update that information too frequently.
And following on from that, sometimes the act of, as you say, revising, the act of taking down your PC's equipment, I very often made as part of the kind of pre-game chat around the table. So I'm sitting down to everyone, oh, how's everyone doing? Oh, looking forward to playing tonight. Maybe crack open a drink, and then as you're sitting down to begin the session, just at the start, I'm going around the table going, all right, what weapon have you got? Oh, okay, you've got that. And the armor, cool, okay. And now all the other players are listening. Oh, we know that this player's got a double-handed sword and this player's got a mace and stuff. And you kind of ground yourself at the table with the other players by going round everyone's kit and then they can all see that I'm writing it down in my GM's kind of notebook. So I've got it all now in front of me. I know that player 1's armor class is 16, but player 2's is only 13 or whatever it might be. It gets everyone on the same page.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it begins to have that sink into the game world as well, as you start like asking those kind of game related questions. It gets everybody's head into that mindset. But I think what's the most important of all those stats is the hit points. Make sure you have a current track of your players' hit points, because there's nothing worse than rolling the damage dice for a monster and saying you take 8 hit points, and then that player goes, "Oh, I'm dead," and you kind of go, "Ooh, I didn't realize that you were so close to dying." It'd be a really good idea for the GM to know exactly the health level of all of the players around the table. And this is even more important, I think, in online games, because we're not sitting in a table where I can watch my players crossing their hit points off next to me. Quite often we're playing on a screen and that information isn't readily available to the GM. So making sure you have the current hit points at the start of the adventure and then crossing them off as your monsters are doing damage to the PCs allows you to know the health condition of the party in general and any individual player, and can allow you to fudge maybe some dice rolls and some attacks if you choose to do that. If you have 3 fighters in the group and you know one of them is really, really wounded and they're fighting a bunch of orcs, then have the orcs attack the other guys. And that could be an in-game reason. As the orcs see this one is too wounded, they decide to focus on the stronger fighters, or just, any of those reasons that you can do to try and balance things out a little bit. Because sometimes in the heat of combat or in the heat of a game, you as the GM might lose sight of the fact that, poor Bob's character only has 2 hit points left, and the other 2 have 20 odd hit points. Because of whatever reason, they fell into a trap earlier or whatever. But if you want to keep in track of those hit points, and then you decide to like dish out damage across the board, and it doesn't really harm the other 2, but then that means Bob's dead, maybe give Bob a break. Do you know what I mean? At that point. So I think it's important that the GM knows the player character's either health status, whether it's hit points you're using or wound levels or whatever it happens to be in any system. Be aware of of the PC's health condition going into any combat. Is going to allow you to make that combat a little bit more dramatic. And there are different GM styles. You can some follow the letter of the dice. So if that's how much damage the dragon's done, that's how much damage the dragon has done, and you players are going to have to just accept that, and that's fine. But some of them like to what we call fudge their dice rolls, so reduce the damage behind the GM screen to make it a bit more dramatic. So you might want to bring Bob down to 1 hit point or 2 hit points, but you don't want to bring Bob to minus 10 hit points or minus 20 hit points, or you don't want to massively kill Bob. I mean, death in D&D isn't... It's actually very hard to die in D&D 5th in a party of adventurers. But obviously, as this discussion covers all different types of RPGs, some role-playing games are a lot less forgiving with character death and 0 hit points. So unless you are really sure you have given the player characters enough opportunity to assess the situation and back out of this combat should they choose to do it, then you don't want to kill them unnecessarily. Because sometimes, whether it's a surprise or an ambush or an accidental overroll of the damage dice, you might end up killing a player character when you think, does this death serve the purpose of the story? Does this death serve the adventure? And I don't want to get into it too much now, but character death is another thing which GMs shouldn't be afraid of, but it's also something that should be very well considered. And as combat necessarily is the very thing that makes you lose hit points more than anything else in the game, I think understanding where you stand and where the group stands on character death is very important before you do combat scenes. Are your players aware that if their characters die, they can just roll up another one and get back in which case that's absolutely fine. Feel free to just roll the hit points and kill as many people as you can. However, if you're playing a long drawn out, Warhammer Fantasy campaign or whatever it happens to be, and you've spent a lot of time and energy on these characters, and you're going to outright kill one of them by an encounter which isn't really important to the story and doesn't feel dramatic, and the characters haven't had a lot of chance to escape from, then I would say that's a little unfair from a GM's point of view, and you should kind of balance yourself a little bit going, well, is it going to be fun for everyone if I kill a character in this combat? And if it's not, then don't do it. So, I mean, that mechanically, that's a good thing to know, the hit points.
A lot of what you said speaks to kind of this style of GMing where you're more focused on the way that the game is presenting to you rather than the story that you're trying to tell. If you're relying more on the dice telling you how much damage the dragon has done rather than how dramatic is this dragon breathing fire at the players, there you go. There's two different styles of game. So while I agree with everything Jamie has said, my personal stance would be, as you mentioned, fudging roles. It's something that I think is quite a key tool in the GM's toolbox, and it's something that I openly discuss with people, because you want to think about going into a combat or going into a story. What are we trying to get out of this? What do we really want from this? Because if the answer is we want a long, drawn-out hour-and-a-half combat where everyone's yawning and looking at their phones by the end, then go ahead and stick to the rules. But if you want a fast-paced, memorable experience with heroic moments and opportunity for each of the players to have their own time in the spotlight and opportunity for kind of dramatic events to occur, then that is when I personally start to stray a little bit further away from the mechanics and a little bit further away from the numbers, and just think, okay, what is everyone's face is lit up right now. So whatever I'm doing as the GM, I've got to keep that momentum going. So if I'm saying, right, sorry guys, I've got 5 more rounds of this combat, and everyone's yawning, then wrong move. If the combat feels like it's coming towards a conclusion, you've got a lot of the story left to go. The players have got all these things they want to do. You're in this fight. Draw the fight to an end. Who cares if the monster has been on more health, or who cares if the monster hasn't been defeated yet? Draw that to a conclusion. Maybe he flees, or maybe the players get one up on him, or maybe he doesn't have as many health points as they think he has. Whatever it is, it's your game, so don't be beholden to the rules. Let the rules be beholden to you and the story that you want to tell, because that really comes first.
I agree completely with 99% of what you just said. And I think a lot of what you just said there, especially about reading the room and understanding where the combat's going and how long you want it to last, is something that I was going to mention in the dramatic part of controlling combat. So you're absolutely right there. The combat should be serving the story, and players should be entertained around the table, and any GM wants to read the room. I agree with that. That's a valuable skill. However, I take slight issue with the, don't be beholden to the rules are beholden to you. I think that's great in principle, and I think, the rules should be there to support the story overall. However, there is a school of thought that players and whatever who sit down to play a game and have spent a long time learning the rules to this game want to play the game as they understand it. And I think that's especially true in maybe a convention or a tournament style situation where you haven't really met these players, you haven't assembled this group particularly from scratch. People would be like, well, I roll this much damage, I know this creature has X amount of damage, I know the armor class of a particular monster or whatever. People like to know the rules and use the rules to their best advantage. It is up to the GM to manipulate the rules to serve the story, but I think some players may end up feeling slightly cheated should you manipulate the rules in a certain direction that doesn't allow them to do what they want to do. And I think that's less important for some more kind of story-driven or narrative games. I think it's more important for what I call kind of crunchy or mechanical games, which unfortunately I kind of put D&D 5th into that kind of crunchy element of it. I think what a lot of players like to do is manipulate the character classes and items and stuff to get the best mechanical results out of their players. So I think, again, it's about knowing your players and reading the room, but that's why I think for 99% of what you said, I absolutely agree, because I think in most cases, and especially around your own table, then GMs should feel free to manipulate the rules to serve the story. So I do agree with that.
Yeah, it's about what you want out of it, isn't it? And that's a conversation you should be having with the players before you start rolling dice, really, is what do we want to see from this?
It is, but I think sometimes you always have that session zero and a bit of chat about the game, but I think a lot of groups don't really drill down into, what kind of game are we going to play here, guys, and how much emphasis are we going to put on combat, and how we're going to deal with character death. And a lot of people don't really go into that minutiae before they start a game. They might just go like, all right, so we're doing where do we want this game to be set, and how long do we want it to be, and stuff like this. So I think, yeah, it can be a tricky one, but I think you have to bend the rules, maybe, but don't necessarily break them, because I think if the rules aren't working for you as a GM for this game, then actually at that point I would consider, are you using the right rule set? Are you using the right game for this whatever style of play you want to achieve? Because if you find yourself constantly tearing out chunks of the rulebook and throwing it away, then I would say maybe pick a new rulebook. And we live in a wonderful world now where there are a wide variety of different rule sets, going all the way from like super light to super crunchy. So you should be able to find the one that suits you best.
Yeah, and that's part of the fun, I think, and part of my personal measurement of what makes a good games master is how many systems have you had experience with and how many systems can you run. I think is part of what makes an experienced and knowledgeable GM. Not that there's anything wrong for running the same game for 15 years and nothing else, but having that broad variety kind of gives you that expertise.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It definitely makes it easier to understand new systems if you're familiar with multiple. But you can get a very experienced and very good GM who's only read and ran one game for his entire gaming career. There's nothing that doesn't necessarily make you a less experienced GM, I don't think, unfortunately. So there's different kind of experience there. But I think it is valuable to know how different systems work so that you can pick a system that either suits your GMing style or suits the style of story you want to run. But I feel we're going slightly off topic, and I want to try and drag us back to how to make combat more interesting and more dramatic in your role-playing games.
Let's talk about combat.
Yeah. So I think some of the things that are really worth looking at in combat is environment and location. And I can't remember what book it was in. It was a DM's guide or a source book for a role-playing game many years ago. And it was talking about how to make combat more exciting. And I'm dredging through the filing cabinets in my dusty filing cabinets in my brain here to kind of paraphrase this article. But what it was basically saying was, make sure that you paint a very dramatic, very exciting picture to the players of where the fight is taking place. Quite often, especially in D&D and fantasy games, what you'll end up is where it's a hitting match backwards and forwards. So you're just rolling dice backwards and forwards, and where the combat is taking place becomes secondary to how much damage is being done. And we can go for extreme examples like fighting on a rope bridge, fighting at the edge of a cliff, fighting on a boat that's moving around shark infested waters, or if it's a modern game, for example. I was playing in a session of Overlight where the combat took place in a huge abattoir with strange beasts hung up on hooks, and we were kind of fighting in amongst the kind of dusty, swinging dead bodies of carcasses, and it made the combat so much more like visually interesting. That everything we were doing, and the GM was able to use this environment and describe it and everything. So I think more than, and I'm not just saying set it in an inn or do it on a pub, give the players an excuse to interact with the environment in combat. We all these basic things like swinging on chandeliers and sliding down banisters and tearing your way down drapes like some sort of Errol Flynn movie. Do you know what I mean? They're all kind of cliches because that's what we want to see. You want to get involved with that kind of dramatic level of combat. So I think if you, as the GM, you should be really controlling where these combats take place anyway. So if you have a great location set in mind, then prepare that location with not just its kind of how can this combat be interesting mechanically, environmentally, or whatever, but dramatically, how does it look? How does it feel? Are you fighting on a rooftop rather than fighting in the street? Well, that in itself just make it more interesting, because then you have the danger of falling off, but then you also have whatever's going on in the rooftop, and just changing the place where the combat takes place, I think is just so fresh. Try not to have every combat in a pub or every combat in a forest clearing, or do you know what I mean? Like, don't go for that. Find some weird and wonderful places. I mean, inside of a deep cave where nobody can really see, and how does that affect combat? People swinging blindly, torches dropped on the floor, all of these exciting things that just come out of fighting in the dark rather than not in the dark. And so any GM can come up with loads of weird and wonderful ideas of what to do it on the top of a moving car, or on a speeding train, or like fighting in the cockpit of an aeroplane as the pilot is desperately trying to maintain control of the airplane. Do you know, all of these things that just make the combat just more visually exciting, I think is really important.
Yeah, set pieces are one of my favourites for combat as well. Setting something on a building that's falling down, or a ship that's sinking, or lava islands that are forming and reforming and connecting and then disconnecting. I love set piece combat. Always works a treat.
Yeah, And to go back to what you said as well, what it maybe allows you to do is use the environment as the kind of do ex machina, where you can stop the combat or end it if the GM, if you need to, if you feel like this combat's gone on too long. And I think that's part of it. Kind of ties into mechanically, but and it reiterates what you've just said. If this combat has gone on too long, make the creature run away or flee, or not every creature has to fight down to its 0 hit points. And I know a lot of systems have a morale kind of level in there, or a disengagement level, but make sure you're aware of that and don't be afraid to move that forward or make the character more cowardly than it normally would be. Not every, I don't know, ogre has to have set morale of whatever. This ogre might be particularly cowardly, and if it suits your purpose to have this ogre want to run away, then just have him run away. If you feel the combat's gone on too long and it's not serving any more dramatic purpose, then just do whatever you can to get the combat finished. And that's not robbing the players of finishing off the monster or gaining the XP or whatever. And this also gets into how you dish out XP and things like that. As long as you've defeated that creature, you should really be getting the XP. Anyone who's just giving out XP for the actual monster death is something else entirely, and that's something you should look at. But yeah, I think, as you said, set pieces and interesting environments, I think can change the way that combat feels in any game. So it's well worth thinking about that as you're putting your adventure together.
Yeah, and I've got 2 tips that I want to follow up this with. My one tip is I've noticed, especially in Dungeons and Dragons, but in other games too, it almost seems like combat is separate from role-playing, and if you can combine the two, then I think you're onto a winner. Have you noticed, for example, in a game of D&D 5e, there's never any dialogue, no one's talking during the combat, and you could have 2 hours of combat, and you got 6 players and some bad guys, and no one says a word. It's just sword swing, shield defend, Have your NPCs talk to the players during combat, have them trash talk, or have them say, try and sway them another way, or have them pleading, or have them taunting. You can go for a 2.5 hour combat in Dungeons & Dragons without a single word being spoken, and I think when the combat ends, suddenly the players are speaking again. It's almost like 2 different parts of the game. So if you can try and combine those together, I think you're onto a winner there as well. And try and have role playing in the combat one and the same instead of 2 separate facets.
I think that's absolutely brilliant advice, yeah, and you're absolutely right. You can encourage the players doing that by making the NPCs do it first.
Yes.
Have them taking the piss out of them, have them saying things, or and it can also make for very memorable NPCs who are trash talking you or whatever it happens to be. So I think that's really valuable, and that also ties into what every RPG rulebook tries to get you to do. Is try to get the players to describe their dice rolls in a narrative sense, rather than just like, I've hit, I do X amount of damage. And it's all GM led, so you have to do it with the NPCs and the monsters. The monster like leaps out with its claw and scratches down your back, and do you know what I mean? Even though that it tears your leather to one piece, it does scratch, and it's more like 100 paper cuts on your back. So it hasn't caused you much blood, but it stings. And then you say 3 damage, and that's much better than just go, it gives you the owlbear does 3 damage or whatever, and that's so boring. But if you do it as the GM, what you'll tend to do is get players to encourage that. Go, I knock another arrow in my bow and I hit him, dead in the chest, 6 damage, whatever, and that's great. A little bit of that too, and that encourages that role playing. So even if the player characters aren't saying anything, then at least they are adding to the narrative of the scene, the drama of the scene. Exactly. So yeah, couldn't agree more. What was your other one?
And that you're actually leading on to my second point quite nicely. So you want to get the players involved, even if their characters aren't openly talking. You want to have the players role playing, and combat's a great place for people to go a bit wild. If especially they make a good roll, you can say, so describe to the table, how have you made this attack? Well, I've done a backflip and a triple roundhouse kick and thrown my longsword or whatever. It's fun for players to be competent, and when you're role playing, you want to be you want your player character to be competent. I mean, unless you're playing maybe Warhammer Fantasy or something, but I'm talking in general terms. When players sit down with their character, they want their character to be good at the things that their character is good at. And this is where D&D can fall a bit flat. I'm a hunter. I roll to track the wild bear's footprints, and I roll a 1. It's like, that's not that. So I'm not good at anything then if I can't even do the one thing that my character archetype is designed to do. So with that in mind, let's say you've got a fighter who takes a slash with a sword at a skeleton or something, and the fighter, whose entire existence is built around the fact that he can fight, rolls a 3 or a 4 or rolls a miss. Maybe instead of going, you missed the attack, maybe have the fighter still making a competent attack, but the skeleton deflects it, or the skeleton moves, or it's the miss corresponds to something outside the character's sphere of influence. So the character doesn't lose face, the character is still a competent fighter, but he rolled a miss. Maybe the set piece that you're fighting on tilts and knocks him off balance, or maybe his enemy defends the block or dodges underneath the blow or something like that. There are a lot of ways to continue combat and carry that momentum going and still have the players have this sense of power in their characters, which I think players should have, deservedly. It's kind of part of the experience of role-playing, is that you want to play as someone who is capable. You get to maintain that during a combat, even though they might roll 5 misses. Every time it comes around to his turn, miss again. Every time it comes around to his turn, miss again. Instead of going, my fighter's shit, they'll instead be thinking, wow, this opponent's really tough. You know, and their dice rolls, they'll still be failing the dice rolls, but they put those failures onto the world and onto the opponents and not onto feeling any less about themselves. And I think it's a really big paradigm shift. And when I started doing that in my own games, I noticed the effect that it had on the players at the table and on the atmosphere of the game. It can make such a difference.
I think that's super valuable, and I think it's super smart, and I think it's not the players that fail, it's the world that's hard. I think that's wonderful, and I think bouncing back off that again is, and I've done this before, and I think it's really good for encouraging players. But I've an amazing friend who's running Overlight for me at the minute, and he uses these 5 words all the time, especially when it comes to combat. Tell me how that looks. Yes. And I just think that is amazing when he just says that. Tell me how that looks. So I'm going to, like, if I roll and I hit and I do damage, and he just steps back and goes, great, tell me how that looks. And it gets your creative juices kind of flowing and kind of like getting into it, and you just start being more florid and more kind of interested in what your attack looks like and what you're doing. And I just think anything that passes that dramatic agency back to the players is just such a good thing, because you're absolutely right, especially with D&D. Combat can very quickly fall into being formulaic and very, very boring and not role-playing. You're absolutely right. It almost becomes like a separate war game that you're doing, just like a game of Yahtzee with dice, and then you go back into the role-playing once the combat is finished.
Yeah, and it is a shame, in a way, because it's where a lot of people start, and it's probably not the best experience to start with for role-playing or combat, yet it seems to have the most of both. So look, I mean, I started with 5e and then quickly realised that my interest lay elsewhere. But it's a gateway book in the way that when I read it, I thought to myself, I need to be able to do this better. What are my other options for doing this in a way that's going to suit me more? And even in that respect, it's a valuable experience because I know what I don't like, and that's very useful to me. You know.
I think, especially for me personally, I'm a lot less forgiving for D&D's kind of long combat. But I do think that a lot of people getting into D&D recently are maybe coming at it from a kind of Final Fantasy or Warcraft kind of background. And they're a bit more used to this kind of grinding combat where you're just repeating the attack, and the monster is fighting back, and you're building up to a combo, and the cleric is at the back healing you, and all of this kind of this mechanical aspect to combat. I think a lot of players bring that into the game, especially if D&D is the first game they've come into from that kind of computer game background. But you're right, that I think there's much more to it, and I think any GM who has just started a group and you haven't done a lot of other stuff, and maybe you do have a Warcraft background or a Final Fantasy background, don't take those combats as the example of how to run your D&D combat. You know, don't just go in for that long grind, that button clicking, you know, I've been here for 20 minutes, I've got to defeat this dragon, because there's just nothing more boring, and it will, even if your players seem to be enjoying it the first few times and destroy the monster and get a great satisfaction from that, story-wise and play-wise and entertainment-wise and fun-wise, your group has spent 45 minutes doing what it could have done in 10. And that's the biggest thing for me. Make your combat last as long as this should, not that long, because it can really... time is valuable to us all. And I mean, we're in a group where we only play 2-hour sessions. And we play quite regularly, which is fantastic. But those 2 hours are quite important. So the last thing we want to do is probably spend an hour doing a combat, because then we don't get to play a lot of the game, a lot of the rest of the game. So if we have a combat, even if it's a big drawn out combat, it's probably only going to last 20 minutes, half an hour, and that's great. And there might only be one of those in a session. But as long as you know how much time you've got and how much time you're going to spend in combat, most of us, even us who are blessed with a lot of time, don't do RPG sessions that tend to be longer than 4, 5, 6 hours at the most. And, you know, if you've taken 2 hours of that with combat, then you're only really playing the other 3 or 4 hours. So have a look at that, you know, look at, with a step back, with a critical eye as the GM, and go, how much time am I actually spending in this adventure or with this group doing combat, and could I reduce that down, make it more exciting, but in even more combats. You can put 3 or 4 or 5 different fights in for the same time it would take you to do one drawn out fight. That's kind of where you look at it. You need to look at that ratio of combat versus kind of narrative and storytelling and exploration and social and all that kind of stuff.
And you don't want your players to be groaning when you say roll for initiative. You want it to be exciting or unexpected or shocking, or it's got to be something that elicits emotion, not kind of dampens it at the table.
Couldn't agree more.
If you're saying roll for combat and people are groaning, then there's too much combat, the combat's too long. Or, you know, I've played in campaigns where you try and do everything you can to avoid getting into any fight because you know that's the next hour of time gone. So you're like, right, well, what's the solution to this that doesn't involve anyone attacking anyone else, because I actually value my time, you know?
Yeah, and that's bad, isn't it? That's the last thing you want from a GM, for your players to feel like that. And I think because GMs, quite rightly, view combat as such an important part of the game, then we're not saying don't do combat. We're just saying do combat smarter. Do it smarter. Use it, you know, make it more interesting, more flashy, more exciting. And you can still have attack rolls and damage rolls and stuff, but just tie it up. And I think this is maybe part of the problem when players or characters get to a much higher level and have much higher hit points and stuff like that. All you need to do is scale everything up. So if the fighter has 40 hit points, don't give him goblins that do 4 damage. Give him goblins that do 20 damage. Do you know what I mean? However you want to work that in, that's what should be happening. You know, combat, I think I'm going to paraphrase you here again, and it stuck with me since you said this. You know, combat should be kind of unpredictable, nasty, and short, because that's what it is in real life. Do you know what I mean? And I think if you can drag that into whatever setting it happens to be, whether it's a gunfight in Cyberpunk or a pitched battle in D&D, that's what it should feel like. It should be over quick, and one side should be defeated or dead pretty quick, because or both sides have decided not to bother, because that's kind of how combat goes. Yeah,
it's unfair and it will fuck you up. And if you don't have that sense of dread going into it, then it doesn't have the stakes that a lot of combat needs. I mean, obviously see previous episode for a discussion on combat in RPGs, but one of the reasons it's features so heavily in a lot of games, and one of the reasons that a lot of games are so combat based, or at least have no qualms about including a lot of physical violent combat in, is because these games are drama taken to the extremes. Like with film, we take what we know and we extrapolate that out to its very extremes in order to still be able to understand it, but explore it in a way that we can't do in our real life. And what is combat but the most highest stakes situation that you could be in? It is life or death, and you're exploring a life or death situation, maybe with a character that you're playing who is skilled and able to survive that life or death situation with some degree of grace, maybe. But if the combat loses that idea of I could die at any moment during the next few minutes, then ask yourself, why are you doing it? I think why is this combat happening if there's no element of if there's no tenseness to it, if there's no tension, what's the combat for?
I couldn't agree more, and it comes back to what I said at the beginning of this about understanding where you stand on character death, because the players will very quickly figure out that if you are never going to kill them, and that means if the players know that they're safe, they will go into every combat without the requisite dread and terror that combat should have, even for somebody who was experienced and wielded a sword for some barbarian who's fought his way across, Hyperborea, then he should be nervous about going into any combat, even if he thinks he's going to win, because he knows the stakes. He knows that this could be his last fight or whatever. That's actually what keeps him alive, being so aware and self-aware of the combat. So I think you're absolutely right. I think if there isn't a chance for character death in that combat, then what's the point? It's quite reductive, but it's also very true.
Yeah. Or maybe the barbarian has stayed alive so long because he knows to avoid combat with big monsters that are past his skill level. He doesn't go away into fights that you can't win.
And I think always promoting and giving the players an opportunity to get out of combat should they realise things are not going their way is another GM tactic. Make sure that the player group and the characters both know that running away is an option. Just because you place a troll under the bridge doesn't mean that the group going, oh, well, I guess we got to fight this troll. Well, no, you don't. Maybe don't cross that bridge. Maybe run away from the troll. Maybe bargain with it. Maybe, have to cross the river at a higher point, which then involves a whole host of kind of, team building, raft exercise or something. Like whatever it happens to be, the combat, you can place these physical problematic people and or monsters and or situations in the game. It doesn't mean the players have to interact with them. They can choose to look at that situation and go, actually, that's too much for us, and we're not going to tackle that just yet. Just because there's a beholder in a cave somewhere doesn't mean you have to go and fight it. If you're level 1, like that would be foolish. And that's at the point where the GM really should start killing characters, because they've made an active decision to go and fight something that the GM has kind of pretty much warned them is out of their league. But I think taking the beholder out of the game just because the first level characters can't handle it is stupid, and it starts making the game. It just reduces the game to something less exciting and less dramatic.
Yeah, and your world's got to have consistency to it, and it's got to be consistently dangerous for the players to feel like they're in a part of it. And what you were just saying there has made me think of 2 more tips.
Go.
Coming off the back of what you were saying there, I think I learned this from Apocalypse World, and it's actually served me quite well. But I think when your characters are in danger, or when something's about to happen, you should telegraph that to them and give them a chance to do something about it, instead of, for example, you've got a group of PCs walking down an alley and they meet a burglar, and you strike up a conversation as the burglar NPC saying, give me all your gold or whatever. The player characters laugh and say, no, of course not. And then I say as the GM, he stabs you, take 3 damage. They go, but what? Whereas, alternatively, I say, he gets out his knife and approaches you, he's going to stab you, what are you going to do about it? It then passes the scene to the players to the point where they know danger is coming. You're telegraphing that danger to them, saying, look, you're going to get hurt here unless you do something about it. But this is, at the end of the day, a game for the players. What are you going to do now that you're in this situation? So try not to spring damage on them from unexpected places. Try to let them always have an opportunity to do something about it, instead of just dropping damage in their lap or dropping situations on them unexpectedly. It can be quite dissatisfying for players. You want to make sure that they have a chance to react to things. And if they react and get the dice roll wrong, then give them the damage that was coming, and then they know what's happened, but at least give them a chance. Don't drop things in their lap unexpectedly, because it can come across as unfair, and it can be dissatisfying to play.
Yeah, and also, don't chase the player group with an encounter that they are clearly not interested in taking part in. If you bring an NPC and the NPC seems to want to have a fight with them and the players make an exit, don't then have that NPC turn up 10 minutes later desperate to have a fight and eventually back the players into a situation where they have to fight him. If the player group has kind of signposted to you, the GM, that they're not interested in this confrontation, take that as a sign and move on and give the players what they obviously do find interesting. It's not enough to say, well, actually, no, you are going to be attacked by this person, you have to fight or not. Again, we get back to what purpose does that serve for the story? Like, the GM is then just self-serving himself rather than providing an environment for the players to make the action. So yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, and I can say that I've made that mistake myself in the past, and I've learned from it. I'm now passing that information on to you guys on the podcast, so you're welcome. That's how it works, right? That's what we're here to do, share our knowledge.
Yeah.
Another technique that I use mostly in Dungeons and Dragons games, but always goes down well. If you've got players who are at least slightly familiar with the system or have played before or know the basics of how a Dungeons and Dragons game works, you're sitting down to play with them for the first time, start with 3 words. And as you got your players are settled, got the character sheets out, everyone's got their dice. Maybe the music's on, maybe it isn't. You've got everyone's attention, you've got everyone's eye contact, they're all looking at you. And you say, the very first thing in the game, roll for initiative. And then everyone's eyebrows go up, oh, what's happening? We don't even know what's going on yet, but we know we need an initiative order. And then you immediately, without any setting or preamble or anything, you get the initiative order from them, and then you go into the combat as the introduction to the game, going down the list, your initiative order list, with whatever scene that you've prepared beforehand, and the character who rolled the highest initiative gets to be the first in the spotlight, and the scene opens on them. Maybe you push out from their face, or you open on them on a cliffside, or you open on them locked in mortal combat with whatever enemy you've got prepared for them. But it's a really powerful opening to have people at a table and you just say roll for initiative, and then everyone goes, oh, what's going to happen next? And then you just open up in a big combat. And you can even say, you can do it Vincent D. Baker style and say, right, who are you fighting? Or you're fighting a pirate. Why does this pirate want to kill you? And then the player not only is fighting them, but then says, well, I think he's fighting me because I've stole this gold from him or whatever. Then you're going into different narrative systems rather than something like D&D. There are a lot of different ways to build out from there. You know, you can start the scene in the middle and build backwards and forwards from that, and figure out why you're in this fight. Or alternatively, you can do it the more traditional way and have everything prepared and just drop the players into it in media res, as we say. It's just a great storytelling technique, I think, to kick off an episode with a nice big set piece combat, and then have the players discover what's happening while they're fighting for their lives.
I think there's it can be really exciting to start a session like that. I absolutely agree. New GMs, don't do that every session, because that'll get boring if you do it every session. Use it sparingly. It's a powerful tool, and with great power comes great responsibility, as we know. But it can be a really good way to shake your players awake at the start of a session. As you say, you know, everyone's eyes, you know, go wide and, oh, what are we doing? And it is, it's really great. So if you get a chance to do that now and then, I think is a really strong opener.
Yeah, to be used sparingly.
Yeah, you can even do that in mid-session if you think things are slowing down and people are starting to yawn, and you know what I mean. Even though we've just said don't dump encounters onto players if they don't want them. If you feel like the session needs a bit of spice, then all of a sudden you can just come out of nowhere and go roll for initiative, and that will have people going, what, where, what? You can still then offer them the opportunity to get out of that encounter, but making them roll initiative and letting them know that they're now in a situation that requires fast thinking, fast acting, can be a good way of snapping the players back into attention.
Yeah, getting their attention back on the table, definitely. I mean, you know what, actually, I never thought about this until literally this second, but dealing with people paying attention has been less of a problem since I started running online games, because people are sitting down for the specific purpose of gaming for a few hours at their computer screens over their webcams, rather than when I've done it in person. I felt sometimes like it's more of an effort to keep people on track. This was before the pandemic, maybe, but I'm just thinking about that now, like having to herd players and keep momentum going sometimes can feel easier online than it can do in real life.
I agree. I think there's also there's another few little factors in there. I agree with they've logged on and they've set themselves up to do this. They tend to be on their own as well, so you're not distracted by anybody else in your room. So every player is kind of sitting on their own, and the focus of whatever's happening is on that screen. So that looking at the other players is also just looking at you. That's the same way. And I think when you're sitting in real life, there's a lot of other stimulus going on, and players can then begin interacting with the other players individually rather than with the GM. Look at this on my screen, or what was that movie like, or whatever. It's stuff that isn't pertinent to the game. being online and everybody having this single line into a group from their own locations cuts down on that kind of unnecessary chatter to a degree. It's never going to get rid of it all, but I think that also reduces that. So yeah, it's a good solid point. And I think you touched on it a little bit before, and maybe we're getting onto a bigger subject for another episode, but setting the scene and getting the lights down, or putting the game music on, or like getting everybody into that game mode, that game mindset is so important. And I think logging on, you already have that. You log on to play that game, so you're almost like getting into that game mindset before you press join meeting. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Whereas I think when you're sitting around a table with your pals and you're all talking about what you did the night before or whatever, and then you almost kind of need to say, right guys, it's game time. The lights go down a little bit, the television goes off, the whatever game music you've chosen. And as a technique for that, I've quite often used a theme tune. And it doesn't have to be a theme tune in a television sense, but a piece of music that you play at the beginning of every session, which consciously and unconsciously says to the players, right, real world's time is ending for a bit, game world's time is beginning. And this is that kind of cue, almost that kind of neuro-linguistic cue that kind of shut up now, like or get on your character voices, get on your character heads, because we're entering the world. And it can be something as simple as moving to the table where you play rather than on the sofas, or as I say, turning the lights down, or it can be playing a piece of music, it can be erecting your DM screen, anything that the players will look at and go, all right, okay, he's put his DM screen up, he means business now. Do you know what I mean? Like that's whatever it happens to be. I think having some sort of social cue, and this is much more obviously important in real life games when those start to happen again, which I think people can be doing now. Having that game starting indicator, I think, is really, really valuable.
Yeah, audio and visual cues definitely help. Props help too. In some cases, I also find it particularly important to try and stress player character on player character role playing, as opposed to one player interacting with an NPC of my creation, trying to engineer circumstances wherein the players are role playing with each other about something. I know maybe a lot of experienced GMs will be nodding along to me here, but some of the best and some of the best moments that I'm most proud of as a GM are the ones where I haven't said a word in 20 minutes and I'm just watching all the players interact with each other, and I'm just thinking, this game's coming along very nicely. All the players are enjoying it because they're interacting and they're involved, and I haven't got to do any work. This is brilliant. So if you can, try and make sure that your players are talking to each other or interacting.
Off the back of that, if your players are talking to each other about the characters are talking to each other in the game, as a GM, please do take a step back. Let that continue. Don't interrupt them. Don't let them enjoy that. Especially if they're talking in character to each other, then you're right. That is ultimate success for the game. That's true immersion. So please allow your players to take as much time as they want to discuss their plans in character, or talk about whatever. It may seem unimportant to the plot, but if they're in character, then it's all important, because that's what you're sitting down for. So take that as a great win if the players are doing that, but also let them do that. Give them that time to breathe. Slow the game right down if that's what the players want to do. Let them interact, because there's nothing more valuable than player versus player interaction in that sort of sense. If the players are fighting each other and rolling dice against each other and stuff, then forget that. That's just, something's gone badly wrong. So don't let players actually get into combat or fight each other or any sort of nonsense like that. Do your best to kind of knock the shit out of that. But I think, if players are having in-character discussions at the table, you're absolutely right. That is a win scenario for everybody.
Yeah, and leads to some great moments as well. Some really organic moments that come out of whatever the conversation is.
Because if you're a GM and you're listening to that in-character chat, keep your ears open, because you should be getting tons of cues about what direction they want the game to go in. Because if they're talking about, what if we go into should we go through the sewers? Oh no, maybe there's ratmen in the sewers. All of a sudden you should be making notes going, ratmen in the sewers? Yes, please. You know what I mean? The fact that they've even mentioned it means they're interested in it. And it's great. You should let them kind of their discussion in game, allow it to be a good indicator of what they are interested in.
Yeah, let the players lead the way if you can, and let them tell you, even subconsciously, what they want to see or what they want to happen. Like you just said, there's been plenty of opportunities where I've heard one player say to another, be wary of this enemy they've just made up, and then I've gone, all right, well, I know what you're getting at the end of the session, there's just a bit of combat in there. Well, you mentioned it, so now this is what's happening, and they have no idea. I could have had it planned for however long, but it's that kind of give and take, and you've got to have that. Being a GM is being a good listener a lot of the time, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I'm glad we've spent a bit of time on this chat, because I keep thinking of more techniques that I use, practical techniques, but I would like to say something that has served me well in all the games that I've run is make sure when players are rolling the dice, they know the number they're trying to hit before the dice hits the table and before the dice comes up. You don't want a player to cast a dice on a table, look at the dice, and then look confused and just look at you and say, did I hit or not? You try and avoid that. You want to make sure that the player knows what their target number is. So as that dice is rolling, that's where the tension is. And when the dice comes to a stop and reveals the target number on the face of the dice, that is the build up and release of tension in the dice roll. You want rolling dice to be fun. You don't want it to be confusing and them looking at you. You want the players to be aware of what their skills are and what they should be looking for on their own dice.
I absolutely agree. And actually, I could stress this even more for systems that use a dice pool and not a single dice, because it's very easy to get the player to understand that they need a 14 on the d20. That's great. They'll roll that d20 and be looking at it. But when you're throwing a bunch of dice, whether they be multi-polyhedrals or multi-dice of the same type, you also want them to know what they're looking for, whether it's a total number, a number of successes or whatever. Because quite often with dice pools, that's when the player will just throw and then be looking at the GM for interpretation. So let the player know how many successes they're looking for, what they're gonna need, because then they'll be counting it up. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 successes, great. That means I've done it. Cool. So for dice pools as well as single dice. But yeah, I think that's a great little tip. Players should know what they're looking for, because you're right, it creates that tension, doesn't it? And it's part of why it's a game and not just a story. Dice are involved in order to produce random effects, and the players want to know that they have the power by rolling that random dice to influence, the world that's happening, and they know whether they're going to win or lose that particular task before they roll the dice. And it's out of the GM's hands to a degree. It's out of the player's hands, but physically the dice is in the player's hands. So that's very fun.
Yeah, it's in the player's hands until it's not and it's on the table. Then it's out of their hands.
Yeah.
So I think that's we love our dice. We love our little coloured bits of plastic, and they do hold a certain power, and you want to try and maintain that. And I think having the players be aware of the power of their dice is very important when you're sitting at a table, because otherwise it's like, well, I'm just rolling it for the sake of it then, because the GM's going to tell me anyway, rather than actually no, the dice is the god here. We don't call it the random number god for nothing. Do you know what I mean? It is the overarching kind of dictator of how things are going to go, and that randomness is what we all love about it, what we all love about the hobby.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to unpack there for kind of, especially for new GMs. A lot of experienced GMs will, as you've said, will be nodding away and going, yeah, I'll do that. That's good. Yeah, I get that. That's pretty obvious. But I think for new GMs, just assess how much time you're spending in combat in your session, and make sure that the combat serves the story, and make sure that it's there for a reason, and keep it snappy and keep it exciting. I think is some of the to create the bullet points for that.
Yeah, and have fun with it. If the players want to do something wild, don't say no. Say yeah. Be the yes man. Have fun with it.
Yeah. GMs should, even if you have to be yes but, that's much better than no.
Yes, be the yes but man.
There's nothing worse than a GM saying no, you can't do that. You go, well, yes, but that's going to be really dangerous. Or you're going to need to do this. Or you're going to be a facilitator.
Exactly, be a facilitator. That's great. Yeah. So thank you for sending in those Instagram questions, because I got a lot out of that talk, and I remembered techniques and tips that I didn't have written down, or I didn't have memorized to come into this. But when I'm thinking about how I run games, it made me realize all these little techniques that I do use. So that was really I hope that was really helpful for you guys to hear.
Yeah, and even if you just have to slide one of them in at first, you don't have to remember everything straight away. Just use one of those techniques, and then when you've got that under your belt, throw in another one, and before you know it, you'll be, having more fun, and that's really what it's about. Everybody having fun at the table and producing a story that everyone can talk about later and reminisce on. That's what you want.
Yes, that's what everything that we've discussed in this conversation so far is really geared towards, is people having fun, having a story to tell. That's what we're here for.
Cool.
Send in more questions to ask us. Send in more.
Don't wait for us to do another poll. Get at us in the Discord, which is definitely the best place to kind of raise these topics. But if you're not on the Discord, then hit us up on the Instagram, message us, comment on one of the posts, email us if you have to, humanenergyfieldpodcast@gmail.com. Send us an email with any of your thoughts on the show or anything you want to hear us talk about. Then please get at us there, because we will take these things on board and use them as jumping off points for our conversations.
Yeah, and it's always great to share the knowledge, share the love, and with that in mind, we are going to finish this episode with a little bit of chat about how our Warhammer narrative campaign is coming along.
Forges of Nothos. Forges of Nothos.
I just love the kind of tiny little community that we've built up doing this so far. We're still in the beginning. It's not yet the end of the beginning, so it's not too late it's never really too late to jump on board with this, but if you are listening and you have a little inkling to build an army list or to put something together, then definitely check out the Discord and come get involved, because it's still building up, it's still building hype. There's still a long way to go with this thing, and we're all having an absolute blast in the Discord, aren't we, doing it?
Yeah, I think it's great. It's this thing where you can rekindle this love for a hobby that you've maybe dropped out of a little bit, or it's a new way to approach the hobby that you're still in. If you're used to building your 2,000 point tournament lists and stuff that you use at the gaming community, that's great. But then if you fancy just doing a really cheeky 500 point old school list with some models that you forgot existed, or stuff you have lying around, or you just want to do a single character and you want to have some context for that character or group or gang or whatever it happens to be, then Nothos is a playground for you to kind of get involved with that and just go, right, what am I made here? How does it fit into this? Because trust me, whatever it is you bring from the 40k universe, we can find a reason for it to be on the madness that is Nothos. And we're learning more about the world and why it's such a hub, and what its history is, and what kind of forces are moving around on it. And I think that's what's most fun about it. I think as people bring their new little army they want to do, or a little piece of fluff story, kind of like it, then you use that to bounce off that and go, oh yeah, that's great, actually this ties into something I had an idea about, and that it's this patchwork thing that's coming out of it, which I really love. And I think we're reaching the point where hopefully pretty soon we're going to get some models on the table and get playing, and I think that'll be a really fun time as well, and start detailing some of these super narrative driven games that we're gonna be playing, really, isn't it?
We're all about the narrative here at Human Energy Field. All about the narrative.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's just some absolute wild, wacky things that are coming in from the Discord, which we're just having a great time looking through. Not anything that we ever expected when we were doing our world building for this thing. We put together a timeline that seemed to us broad enough that people could introduce whatever they wanted, but I don't think either of us really expected the degree to which new strange miniatures and new strange ideas and things have been thrown in from all types of people all across the globe as well. It's a real melting pot at this point, and I'm having an absolute blast reading through and getting to grips with it all.
And anyone who wants to get involved, you don't have to be buying miniatures and putting these miniatures together. If you just want to get involved in the story side of it, or if you just want to write some army lists and suggest some stuff, and it's as much a creative pot for that just discussion and things like that than it is about making the miniatures. Great if you want to bash some miniatures together. We've seen some awesome stuff going. We've seen people picking up some old school minis that I haven't seen for ages, that just really excite me about looking at some of these like 3rd edition forces. But the codexes and the rulebook for 3rd edition is such an amazing font of kind of grim, dark creativity, and the army lists are full of so many random stuff that I just want to see more and more kind of crazy ideas come out there. I'm getting a real excitement about that, and realizing how mass space wolves can kill them all. So.
We'll see about that, my friend. We'll see about
Trash
that.
talk already. You know it's real. You know it's getting real.
We're absolutely going to have a games day at Warhammer World, and we're also thinking about doing something further up north as well. Probably won't be at as nice scenic tables, but will still be equally deadly. We just want to put some games days together, at least here in England and Great Britain, for people to come together.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for those in the community further afield in Europe and America, it's no less of an opportunity to get involved in terms of the writing and the miniature building. I've seen people discussing putting a Nothos US thing together, which would be pretty cool. So there's lots of different ways we can get involved and have an ongoing tournament just because we can't get around the same table to move minis about.
Yeah. And I think also, don't just look at it as armies. If you want to do, like I just said before, a character or a gang or whatever, or it doesn't even have any rules, it just has some cool background, that is also legit. It is all legit for Forges of Nothos. It's real inclusive, which is what I love about it. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, this is the home for super narrative Grognardian inclusivism.
You heard it here.
You heard it here. Anything that falls into our bracket, we all take on board and latch onto.
Yeah. But the best place for that is come on the Discord, where we have a dedicated Forges of Nothos channel. If you want to see what it's all about, listen to previous episodes, or just jump in there. We've got like a little Nothos primer, and we're kind of building that as we go. And I think there's going to be some new stuff on there in the next couple of weeks, isn't there? So as we kind of add some stuff in there. So
yeah, it's always growing at its own pace, and I love logging into the Discord because I know that Forges of Nothos channel is always got things going on. It's probably the most active channel in the whole Discord. I think there's always people chatting
which is weird. As we did it as this kind of like we fancied doing some Warhammer, and we looked at Third Ed and just thought, let's do this, and it's grown into this thing, which is wonderful. So I like it.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying it, honestly. So if you're listening to this and you're a part of that already, thank you so much, honestly, because it brings us both a lot of joy. And if you're not yet involved, then please do so. I think that's about all we've got time for this week. What do you reckon, mate?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. We covered a couple of the answers. If you sent in suggestions for us to talk about and we didn't cover them, don't worry. We are looking at that list. We shared that list and talked about it today, and we just pulled out a couple of those things out there. There are some games that people want to talk about, and some that we're going to go into greater depth that needed more time. So we will be covering games like Symbaroum, and we'll be talking a bit about Dragonlance, the old Superheroes, Rifts, Heroes Unlimited game, a load of other ones off the top of my head that people wanted us to chat about. So we will be talking about all of these different games in a bit more depth, but we want to give each subject a decent treatment. So we'll be bringing some of those things up over the next few episodes for sure.
Yeah, so if we didn't answer your question, stay tuned. We'll get around to it. There's always a backlog of things, and before I have the time to arrange any kind of other engagement with the podcast, this is a great way to get involved. It's very quick and easy, and you can get your thoughts and questions onto the show pretty fast. So do keep an eye out for that, guys.
Yeah, nice one.
Thank you for listening, everyone. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure. I hope this has been a enlightening episode. If you enjoyed us giving practical tips and practical advice on role-playing, then do let us know, because it's not something we've done before, actually given practical advice, but it seems to be something that people have asked about. So if it has been helpful, then we would love to hear any kind of feedback from you. Check out the Instagram, Human Energy Field. Check out mine and Jamie's Instagrams at Gamma Valley, at Colosseum Rex. Email us at humanenergyfieldpodcast@gmail.com. Join the Discord on any of the links that I've just mentioned previously. Come and get involved. And until next time, good night, stay safe.
Stay hydrated.